What that means, I think, is that you have this stubbornly high inflation. We're not going to go down to our targets for a number of reasons. And then there has to be the real interest rates remaining high in that. And that creates a sort of stagflation kind of environment.
In today's video, Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, discusses where we are in the changing world order, the macroeconomic outlook, and the rising tensions between the US and China.
But back to your question in terms of the mechanics, there are very basic, simple things. That there is a debt cycle. There are short debt cycles. We're used to those. They last on average about 7 years, give or take about 3. And you have recession and interest rates are low, inflation is low, and the Federal Reserve becomes stimulative, and then you have growth. You have non-inflationary growth, and you have inflationary growth, and they tighten monetary policy, and then you have the slow up or the recession that follows until the cycle participates. It happens that way. We've had 12 of those. We're in the 13th. We're about halfway through that cycle. We're at the point where interest rates have to rise. Okay, so the level of interest rates, you have to satisfy a debtor and a creditor. And so that means interest rates have to be high enough that the creditor gets a real return, higher than their money. And if you don't do that, you create the cycle that we have before, where money is essentially free, interest rates are nil, or in some cases negative, and you have a situation where you don't have to pay principal, so money was essentially free. Then that imbalance is enormous, and it's made more enormous because even then the supply-demand is not adequate. There's not enough demand to buy those bonds, and so the Federal Reserve's got to come in there and print money and buy those bonds and redistribute wealth. So you have that. So now we have moved to a level of real interest rates. Think about inflation. That is, depending on how you calculate, if you look at tips, or if you look at short-term interest rates, they need a 1 to 1.5% real rate. Those days that we have seen in the past are over, and there's a big adjustment in that. So the headline for that is, so who have been the losers? Who have been the winners and who have been the losers? This is a different kind of debt problem, in that what happened is, in order to create this big transfer of wealth that there needed to be, in various ways, the government borrowed a lot of money because they spent a lot more than they earned, and they sell a lot of bonds. And then the Federal Reserve buys bonds, and it subsidizes those bonds. And so the big losers of this cycle has not been the individual balance sheets, because the individual balance sheets have been improved. It is the fact that those who are holding government debt are the ones that are having the losses. So the central banks have all lost a lot of money. The commercial banks bought a lot of these debts. So when we look at the commercial banking problem, it is largely a government debt problem, because there was the financing of holding bonds with short-term interest rates, and so that was the squeeze. So you have that particular dynamic. As we move forward, the higher you raise the debt to income ratio, the more difficult that balancing act becomes. And so we're seeing a trade-off now that interest rates have got to be high enough for the creditor, but not too high for the debtor. And so you're seeing now this adjustment in which you're having sort of a 1%-ish growth rate, not the household sector having a problem, but those who are holding the bonds and so on, they're having the problems. And so you're seeing growth come down with still an inflation issue. The inflation issue comes from two parts, really. First of all, if you spend a lot more than you earn and you give a lot of money in credit, you're going to have an inflation. But it also comes from the supply-demand of bonds. So if you look at who's benefiting in this, the household sector, the workers, are benefiting. This isn't a classic recession in which the unemployment rate goes up, because the unemployment rate is remaining relatively good because there's wealth transfer, and you have, and they are also having higher wage gauges. And then you have the inefficiency of the global supply chains, which happens there. So what that means, I think, is that you have this stubbornly high inflation. We're not going to go down to our targets for a number of reasons. And then there has to be the real interest rates remaining high in that. And that creates a sort of stagflation kind of environment.
Some people argue, in fact, that we will have the inflation come back down on its own, and therefore the nominal rates, if you add your 1 to 1.5% on top of it for the real interest, they will come down. Do you disagree with that?
Yes. It's a matter of the amount of money and credit created, and it's also a matter of productivity. And so when we look at the amount of money and credit, we will spend a lot more than we will earn. We know the budgets, we know the projections, we know individuals. The big risk there is a supply-demand risk. So we are going to sell a lot of bonds, and then the question is, does the Federal Reserve come in and then start to print and make that? So I think from the demand, including employment and the amount of money creation, we have that power. And then we're also living in a different world, particularly as supply chains change. The only big question is the technology impact. Like if we take a 5-year, you were talking about a longer term horizon, we'll have to talk about technology and the impact that that'll have on that in terms of productivity. But the demographics is not a favorable thing because what we're going to have to do is draw down savings, and there's going to be lesser number of population. So in terms of the labor component, I don't see that as a net positive.
You mentioned that going out, it looks like we're going to be borrowing more than we're earning. Does that mean we are in or headed for a debt crisis? You wrote a book on that as well, studying debt crises since 1945. Are we in a debt crisis, or are we headed for one?
We are in my opinion, we are at the beginning of a very classic late big cycle debt crisis, when the supply-demand gap, when you're producing too much debt, and you have also a shortage of buyers. What's happening now, as we have to sell all this debt, is we then do have enough buyers. There are changes now in terms of the quantities in the world that are being held by large investors around the world that have lost money in these treasury bonds and so on. And then there are geopolitical changes which are having an effect. Some cases, some countries are worried about sanctions, and then there's this geopolitical shift. So when I look at the supply-demand issue, there's a supply-demand issue for that debt. There's a lot of debt. It has to be bought, has to have a high enough interest rate. So a crisis, that's, if we continue down this path in terms of what's likely over the next, 5 and 10 years, then you reach the point that balancing act becomes very difficult.
How will we know? And is it really a function of not having enough buyers for the federal debt? Is there any evidence of that so far?
We're right at the brink of starting to find out that. The amount of selling of government debt collapsed, right? We didn't issue government debt. And now we're going to issue a lot of government debt. And so when we look at the buyers, there appears to be a significant shortage of the buyers for that government debt. But we're now at the brink of being able to see what that supply-demand picture looks like as we go over the next year and two.
Given the challenges that we face, fiscal challenges that you describe, we need a political process that will help us get out of it. Do we have that? It goes to the second issue that you always deal with, which is internal conflict.
Well, the things that you see happen over and over again when you look at history is when you have a financial not good situation, at the same time as you have large wealth gaps, you start to see the emergence of populism, and we see extremism in both of the political parties. Okay, we see that split. A populist is an individual or a leader or a political person who will win at all cost, that the rules of the game don't as much matter. And so we're in the January 6th type of incident and so on is very interesting. The political system in terms of primaries and the parties tends to create that sort of polarity. I think that I think it's very clear that there is only one good outcome, if we can, and that's a strong bipartisan middle, because either of the extremes is not going to be able to be dominant. The small right, or even the small left, and as a result, we're seeing a fragmentation. Geographically, you're seeing people move to different areas, not just because of taxes, but of differences in values and so on. And so you're seeing this separation. I think over the next 2 years, the real question is, can we have a strong bipartisan middle, or are we going to have that kind of fragmentation? We have three things aligning that are concerning. On this short-term debt cycle, I call it, the 7-year cycle, we're about halfway through. In other words, interest rates are now at a level that they're probably going to stay at, but they're probably not going to rise much from here, and there's tightness. And the consequences of that are going to be a weaker economy going forward. It doesn't have to be a big downturn because of the household sector, but it is a balance sheet kind of recession. And I think things are going to get worse in the economy. There's a financial issue at the same time as you have this internal conflict. So I think that that's going to make for a risky situation, particularly then when we deal with the third major influence, which is this conflict, this geopolitical conflict in the world, particularly related to China, Russia, and the implications that has on supply chains, production, and the like.